Since the 1990s, the social justice movement, the social left, and the gay rights movement have marched in lockstep. However, in the 2 years following the 2015 SCOTUS ruling for marriage equality and the rise of the social justice movement of fourth wave feminism, many gay men are reconsidering their relationship to the movement. My name is Farrell, and today I'm going to look into the concept of GGTOW, of gays going their own way. One of the most puzzling things about gay culture as it stands today is that with it comes a lot of expectations. Ask any outsider, and most insiders, and you'll find a ton of stereotypes. You'll see fashionable metrosexuals, catty drag queens, hairdressers, and choir teachers. Florists, you name it. Now most of us in this day and age are fully aware that those stereotypes fall short of reality, and we can laugh them off. But there are other ideas that go unchecked, not only outside but especially within the community. Today, I'd like to look into those expectations. Gay men, especially those that are new to the scene, find that there's an orthodoxy of sorts within the community itself. Gay men are expected to vote liberally, to hold views such as feminism in high regard, to reject straight culture, especially that of straight men, with distrust and contempt, and to accommodate a so-called community that is represented by an ever-growing acronym. As intersectional fourth-wave feminism takes center stage as the loudest and most influential lobby, many gay men are chafing under the restraints and ever-increasing demands put upon them by ever smaller groups that decide that they are part of the LGBTQ community. While issues facing the gay men community such as suicide, alcoholism, drug addiction, isolation, and life-threatening STI outbreaks are severe and far-reaching, the level of support that gay men receive for focusing on these issues has gone from the stock answer that blames all these things on a shadowy patriarchy to an outright attack and shaming of gay men that refuse to be silenced on these important issues. Ever since the 2015 SCOTUS ruling that established marriage equality as equally available to gay men and lesbians under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, feminists have waged an outright war on gay men. And the message that gay men receive can't be more clear. We are either to accept being shamed and to being compliant foot soldiers in the pursuit of anti-Western intersectional hegemony, or we're to be made an example of. In the process, spaces that were originally intended for gay men have been co-opted as queer spaces under the feminist rubric, and the modus operandi is the same: embrace, extend, and extinguish. As a result, gay men no longer have the luxury of having our own spaces. From our bars to our publications, even down to our hookup apps, the message has been made clear. Those are no longer our spaces, and if we are to enjoy them, it will only be done in such a way that is pleasing to the elder gods of intersectional feminism. Even history itself is not sacred, with people that were never at the Stonewall riots going to great pains to try to convince us that gay men cowered in the back room, while transgenders of color took on the police, despite every historical account written just days after the riots. So how did things get this way? How did feminism come to control gay men's spaces, our history, our politics, and even our identities? How did the community of gay men, a community populated by men who desire men, become so browbeaten by female supremacists? To answer that question, we need to take a trip back in time to the 1990s. Back in the 1950s and 60s, which is the beginning of contemporary gay culture in the United States, gay men and lesbians had very little to do with one another. Feminism had given rise to lesbian separatism. In fact, the origin of the special term lesbian itself was due to that movement. The two groups, gay men and lesbians, had little in common, and for the most part, left one another alone. In fact, in the feminist literature of the 1960s itself, such as those written by the Red Stockings movement, there is a clear attitude of condescension, mistrust, and outright hostility by feminist leaders toward gay men. Gay men were men, and men were the enemy. In the 1980s, however, things changed for us. The emergence of a type of gay cancer called GRID, or gay-related immunodeficiency, started infecting large numbers of us. In time, and as the bodies stacked up, it was renamed as Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS. But in the public eye, the original name and attribution stuck. For years, the Reagan administration saw our brothers die en masse, and the disease ravaged the gay community. Little, if anything, was done. In the meantime, the disease justified many fears of the time. The civil rights movement of the 1960s and the women's movement of the 1970s had left many religious conservatives with an ideology called dominionism. In dominionism, they would try to address their fears of a changing community and standard by seeking to control government and all forms of discourse. They banded together and formed a political coalition called the Religious Right. This influx gave the Republican Party once the sole domain of fiscal conservatives, a wave of new voters, and cemented their power. It was during that time period, the 1990s, when the AIDS crisis was at its peak and the religious right was at its most shrill, that gay men and lesbians, including the feminists, decided it would be safest if they banded together. In that movement, that moment, the GLB movement was formed, gay, lesbian, and bisexual. As the feminists began to assume control of our organizations, they unilaterally decided that transgender people too needed to fall under the umbrella of our protection. Now, this was not a popular move at the time, and it was hardly without controversy. Despite arguments against the fact that transgender people were added to the group, forming what we came to know as the GLBT movement. This did not last. Within months, the feminists had pushed us to change the acronym to LGBT, despite the numbers of gay men outnumbering lesbians 2-1, and dwarfing the remaining groups. The feminists thought it was necessary to place women, and not men, at the forefront. Ever since then, feminist organizations have set the appropriate parameters for public dialogue of gay men, along with siphoning off gay men's contributions to gay advocacy groups, such as Human Rights Campaign. However, their ambition did not end there. It was not nearly enough to steer the gay men politically. Feminism wanted to define the terms of gay culture itself. In order to make sense of how this was done, you'll need to understand a bit about feminist theory. Feminists, at least prior to the 60s, once espoused a number of political and social theories. The most popular among these was anarchism and communism. You'll find that that's a recurring theme, by the way. Feminist scholar Jean Robinson has written that when women's studies was born in the 1970s, politics was its midwife. In fact, the women's studies programs were not designed to include the hard sciences such as biology, lest biological differences run counter to the narrative they were teaching. No, the feminist theory classes started political and stayed political. While there were many competing philosophies at first, and to a degree, there still are, but they are in the minority. The one that lay the closest to feminists' bold statements of oppression by a mysterious patriarchy found its most compelling ally to be in the form of a small school of philosophy called postmodernism. Just as in feminist thought, all of women's troubles were due to an oppressive patriarchy, so in postmodern thought those sentiments were echoed that all human relationships were solely expressions of power and its use in subjugating others. And so it was taught, throughout women's studies, even to the present day. The thing is, in the 90s, feminists decided that in the 1990s, feminists decided that as the newly christened LGBTQ community, the LGBT community was their domain, they decided to launch an offshoot of feminist theory called queer theory. This was intended to be the social doctrine of the LGBT community. Queer theory was naturally an extension of feminist theory, with all issues facing the LGBT community summed up as a result of actions of an oppressive, heteronormative patriarchy with the intent of expressing, you guessed it, power. Does this sound familiar? I'm sure it does. One of the most famous former communist turned Maoist by the name of Michael Foucault, or is it Michel Foucault? I'm not sure, I don't speak French, wrote about how the true oppression does not consist of overt violence, but through normalization. Reading through these almost indecipherable books, you'll find many current ideals echoed. You'll find masculinity, even in its most innocent forms, demonized. You'll find family structures such as monogamy and raising children dismissed as heteronormative oppression. You'll find phrases like the personal is political, and its corollary, the political is personal. And fitting in? Under Foucault, fitting in was the most egregious act of selling oneself out. Acceptance of Western Enlightenment values were aiding in the so-called oppression. And you'll also find the beginnings of the newest addition to the already awkwardly positioned LGBT community. That was a new letter, Q, for queer. Now it's a funny thing that even today, very few people seem to know exactly what is meant by queer that doesn't already fall under the categories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, or even transgender. Some folks think that the term is redundant, a synonym, a slur that was being reclaimed like the word bitch. I certainly thought that was the case. But as I read more works by Foucault and his followers, I found that this was not the case. Halperin, a student and admirer of Foucault, makes this distinction clear. While gay identity is rooted in the positive fact of homosexual object choice, queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or any stable reality. Excuse me? Now to clarify what he's saying here, while you can point to a type of attraction and say, okay, that's what gay is, okay, that's what lesbian is, alright, that's what bisexual looks like, there is no such litmus test for Halperin's ideal identity, which he referred to as queerness. The deciding factor, according to Halperin and Foucault, was not a matter of one's ontology, but a choice one made to be marginalized. Queerness wasn't defined by ontology. It was not something you were born. It was defined by something that Foucault and Halperin referred to as a performative element. Now breaking this down, and you're going to have to do this a lot when it comes to any postmodernist text, the word queer had nothing to do with who you slept with or who you desired. Gay people were not exclusively queer, transgender, bi, even straight or lesbians. Had nothing to do with any of those. Queer was strictly designated by one's willingness to perform acts of self-marginalization, to make a spectacle of oneself for the sake of making a spectacle of oneself. We have a similar term in my Appalachian mother tongue. You may have heard it. It's called attention whoring. Still, thanks in no small part to queer studies programs that fed and shaped the voices that would become the de facto leaders of the gay community in years to come, many of the beliefs of feminism and of its parent, postmodernism, have been deeply ingrained in the gay culture. No, my friends, queer was not the reclamation of a slur. It was the opening of the floodgate for intersectionality. With the again forced addition of Q to the acronym, and its refusal to define itself for what it really is, the newly christened LGBTQ community took an increasingly political turn. Politics, as it were, became personal. Every struggle was whitewashed as oppression. Every desire voiced to have a normal life was twisted, not into a form of valid self-expression, of positive ways that one could live. No, it was twisted into a form of self-denial. For all the posturing that queer theory had about the evils of hegemony or normalcy, of fitting in, the community as defined under queer theory became increasingly lockstep, unforgiving of differences of opinion or politic, and sought to impose its own power on the greater non-LGBTQ community at large. Now let's fast forward to today. As intersectionality has become more explicit, the Q is no longer content to be the one letter at the end of the acronym. Instead, that Trojan horse exploded into a number of other increasingly smaller and marginalized groups, each one of them clamoring to control the entire narrative and the politics of the group at large. And the gay men, which I will remind you are still by far the largest group and outnumbering the next largest, which would be the lesbian group, by a factor of 2 to 1, were swept off to the side. That leaves us where we are today, men. We live as part of a culture that demands our compliance but refuses critique and is not beholden to care for the needs of the majority of its constituents. In recent days, many of us gay men have looked at the increasing numbers of demands that are hoisted upon us by our alleged communities, and we wondered what exactly those things had to do with us. For the most part, we chose to follow along to fit in. But as we find our voices drowned out, ourselves and our brothers shamed for our alleged privilege, of our history being rewritten, of being told to shut up and know our place, we started asking ourselves in secret the important questions. First, is there ever a point where the so-called community that we must support is obligated to support our needs? Next, if this is my community where I am welcomed as I am, why is it that I must silence myself or risk alienation? And finally, why can't there be other options for us, where we can have our own spaces, celebrate instead of feel ashamed of our masculinity, form our own opinions, and decide for ourselves what we want out of life? Men, today is our day. Just as the straight men, forever shat on from above by feminist culture, have chosen to go their own way, it is also our right as gay men to choose no longer to be defined by groups of so-called allies that refer to us as their oppressors. We no longer have to lord our power over these groups by donating our hard-earned money. We no longer have to violate them with our support. We no longer have to subjugate them to the cruelty that comes with judging them as legitimate. It's time for, in the words of YouTuber Arcatsgay, for GGTOW. It's time for gays to go our own way. This will be the first of a series of videos that I will be doing with my own vision for GGTOW. These are not definitive by any stretch, but I'm hoping they'll offer ideas. My own vision involves reclaiming our masculinity, leaving the ghetto of the LGBTQ community behind, and seeking out brotherhood with our straight male counterparts so that we can enjoy who we are as men to the fullest. I'm hoping that in this first installment, I provoke some thought. Let it sink in. Think about it. Mull it over like a Zen koan. If there is anything that you find useful, then keep it. It's yours. And if there's anything you reject, feel free to throw it away. Ultimately, the choice for what you want and what you believe is yours. Feral out.